Hello, and thank you for joining me on the Path to Liberty for Wednesday morning, September 4th, 2019. Today, we're talking about so-called military defense spending. The U.S. federal government spends at least as much, if not more, than the next 7 to 8 countries combined. And actually, the next 144 countries after that, it spends more than those countries combined, too. And most of this, I would make the case that most of this has absolutely nothing to do with actual national defense. Now, first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every single Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and normally from my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles, but we had a little bit of flooding at my apartment and home studio, so we've been kicked out for a few days, and we're at a hotel also in downtown LA. So sorry about the background, but hopefully it's a little fun thing. I got those palm trees back there for you, for those of you who are watching on the video stream. And I actually am pre-recording this. For those of you watching video, I'll try to engage a little bit in the live chat while we are doing the live broadcast. But for those of you who are on the podcast edition, hopefully the audio quality is good and we're just doing things like normal. Of course, all of our archives, show notes, previous episodes, things that I reference, links that I'm talking about on the show are over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/Path to Liberty, all spelled out. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/Path to Liberty. That's all the archives, all the places you can follow us, all the places that you can subscribe, leave reviews, and the like. Awesome. So thank you guys for joining me today. I really appreciate you spending a little time with me, and I hope you had a really good long weekend. So let's get into this. Now, sometime in July, I actually covered a little bit about corruption and waste in government and spending. I think it was like the end of July. I was talking about the Baltimore issue and the corruption there, but the two-faced nature of politicians who only talk about the corruption in one corrupt city, and they ignore the fact that the military spending and the Pentagon is absolutely nuts as well. So let me just adjust this shot a little bit, and hopefully it looks good. Okay, cool. So I just want to point out here, if you can see on the video here, the U.S. versus world military spending as of 2018. So at that time, the U.S. was spending about $650 billion a year, and the next 7 countries combined, Germany, UK, Russia, France, India, Saudi Arabia, and China, all spent less than that combined. And then the rest of the world, the next 144 countries, spend even less than that. So people who say that the U.S. military is being decimated and need to be rebuilt, really, they're just either they're ignorant or they're lying, maybe a little bit of both. But you can't spend more than basically everybody else, and then the top ones combined, and say that your military is going to crap. It just, to me, that's just propaganda. So I just want to point that out, and I will put a link in the show notes to that. But going forward, check this out. There are actually, this comes from thebalance.com, there are actually 4 components of U.S. military spending. And then when we're talking about that, whatever, $650 billion, and I can't remember what year this was covering, there's actually 4 pieces of it, and the amount that they're spending is more than what they're talking about. So now it's supposed to be up to $750 billion for fiscal year 2020, which is October of this year through September of next year. And so these are the 4 parts of it, the way they break it down, and actually gets higher than what they tell us. What a surprise. So first is the $576 billion base budget for the Department of Defense. And second is $147 billion in overseas contingency operations for the DoD to fight Islamic State ISIS. And so that's the $740 billion, $750 generally people report it as, that has been touted by the president. That's going to be the U.S. military spending for fiscal year 2020. But that doesn't include everything. So number 3, it's the total of other agencies that supposedly protect the country. I don't like how they say they guaranteed protect it, because I think a lot of it is a lie. This includes, this is about $212 billion. It includes Department of Veterans Affairs, Homeland Security, State Department, National Nuclear Security Administration in the Department of Energy, and then FBI and cybersecurity in Department of Justice. So that's another 200 or so billion. And then the last piece is another 26 billion in something called OCO funds for the State Department and Homeland Security. And this was from back in April. They were saying that Congress must pass another spending bill by September 30th to avoid a so-called government shutdown. Of course, it's never a full shutdown. They would come up with some way to have emergency funding and keep these things going. But when you add it all up, it's actually much closer to 1 trillion. It is not just the 750 billion that they say. So it's actually much larger. And most of what they spend on, I would make the case, is actually for military contractors. It's to line people's pockets, possibly even just for military offense. They're not really defending the country. And it doesn't actually incur debts that funded previous wars and military buildups, which actually pushes it even higher. So they're not even counting the interest rate on top of it. That's just part of the national debt or unfunded liabilities of up to, I guess they say 200 trillion, some kind of crazy number that doesn't seem realistic at all, but it really is. So it's well over $1 trillion a year when you actually add up all the interest payments from previous military buildups, previous engagements, foreign policy, war, things like that. And so many of those are still going on anyway. So it just keeps getting worse and worse and worse. And what actually got me thinking about doing this episode, to just kind of talk about this insane spending, was this article over at counterpunch.org, which is a far left publication. I think they do some really good stuff on foreign policy. They're hated by the mainstream left because they attack the left on being pro-war when they're supposedly the anti-war resistance. So Counterpunch has been very consistent on that. I don't like a lot of their economic arguments, but they're good on that generally and on the surveillance state. So this article from Melvin Goodman, The Great Cost and Myth of U.S. Defense Spending. Now, of course, they complain that all the defense spending is taking away the ability to tackle climate change, infrastructure spending, healthcare, and other national challenges, is the way they put it. They're not opposed to the federal government spending. They haven't made the connection that if you've got the largest military empire in the history of the world, why would you trust that same organization to somehow spend to take care of the climate or the healthcare of your grandmother? Because they can't be trusted if this is what their priority is and has been for decades. And that's my view, just as a side note there. But this is what Melvin had to say in this article, and I thought it was actually pretty good. He said, journalists and pundits, I guess this would include me now because this is the same thing I did. He says they regularly refer to U.S. defense spending as greater than the next 7 or 8 countries, just like I did right at the beginning here. And he says that's nonsense. He says U.S. defense spending, when correctly tabulated, exceeds the defense spending of the rest of the global community. And if we look back at that first chart, the next 7 countries after the U.S. are about $600 billion, and the rest of the world is about $520 billion as of 2018. So just a little over $1 trillion. So the U.S. government, when you count it all together, now maybe you have to do an apples to apples. Now this may not be apples. This may be an apples to oranges situation, but it's getting to the point where the U.S. government spends on military and so-called national defense as much as the rest of the globe combined. And to me, that's absolutely nuts. And he says current defense spending is greater than $1 trillion. And that's basically the same numbers that we got from the last report as well. And he says the bipartisan support for U.S. defense spending assures continued increases. All those Democrats that hate Donald Trump, that think he's awful, they claim they're part of this so-called resistance, they continue to vote to approve more money to give to the guy, because they're so tied in to this military-industrial complex that Dwight Eisenhower warned us about so many years ago. And if you go all the way back to James Madison, he told us that armies and debts and taxes are the known instruments for putting the many under the domination of the few. So we've been warned. We should know that this is absurd. We should know that all these politicians are going to continue ripping us off to fund the military empire. And Melvin goes on and he points out that many of the largest spenders on defense around the world, so many of those other top 7, 8, 9, 10, are actually treaty allies of the U.S. So much of their defense spending is actually coming from foreign aid spending from the U.S. government. So I would love to see some calculations. Maybe I can get Mike Meharry to dig in on this at some point to kind of see how much of U.S. funding other countries is actually, we could tabulate it all as U.S. military spending. I'm not sure, but it sounds like it's even worse than what we're thinking about. So Melvin goes on, he says, most estimates of U.S. defense spending cite only the budget figures for the Pentagon, which points towards $750 billion. Those are the numbers that I talked about earlier. You take those two pieces and it was about $740 billion, what the projected amount was earlier this year. So now it's pushing up towards $750 billion. And he says, however, much of the spending of many agencies, particularly in the intelligence community, which is more than $70 billion, is devoted to support of the military. Same with DHS, Department of Energy, Veterans Administration, on and on and on. These are all really part and parcel of U.S. defense spending. And I actually went and I saw a speech many years ago of a guy named Chalmers Johnson. This is the guy that Ron Paul would often cite as a foreign policy expert. He wrote this series of books called the Blowback Trilogy. And I remember him talking about it. He's like, no one actually really knows. So whatever numbers you see, whatever researchers are out there getting numbers put together, no one really knows the total amount. And the reason he said, and this is a guy who was basically a CIA lead asset for Southeast Asia through the Cold War, he said, the reason we don't know is because no one tells us, because there's a massive, probably tens, 20s of billions of dollars more per year in a CIA black budget. Now, the CIA is its own armed force as well, so we could even ramp the numbers up higher than this. Melvin goes on, he says, when these departments and agencies are taken into account, U.S. defense spending greatly exceeds $1 trillion, which finds very little criticism within the Congress or the various think tanks that address the issue of military spending. And both sides, you are not going to find anti-Trump resistance. As a general rule, the vast majority of them are totally on board with this. They don't like the guy who's directing it. They just want their team to be in charge. And just like the same thing happens when the Democrats are in power, you'll hear Republicans talking about how, oh, wow, the spending is crazy. Actually, I think when Obama was in power and the Democrats were running the show to some degree, and they were still increasing the amount of spending on military, Republicans were actually lamenting the fact that they were somehow breaking down the military. They had to rebuild it. But it was just Washington speak. When they say that they're cutting back, they really aren't. What's actually happening is they're just reducing the amount of increase. So instead of being a 10% increase per year or a 2%, it's like a 9% or an 8% or a 1%. It's still growing. It's just not growing as fast as some of these people wanted to do this. Melvin goes on, he says, until recently, the Pentagon budget was the only large federal budget that had never been audited. And last year's audit, which cost nearly $400 million just to do the audit, produced a failing grade for the Pentagon. This is just what Eisenhower warned us about 60 years or so ago on his way out of office, the military-industrial complex. He said it would become, quote, a cross of iron that would limit domestic spending. I would like to see it all limited, but I guess some people want to see an increase on that, and they haven't figured it out yet. Melvin goes on, he points out that there's hundreds of U.S. military facilities overseas, hundreds of thousands of U.S. military personnel, and he compares it to China, which has one overseas facility, a small one in the Horn of Africa. Russia has modest air and naval facilities inside Syria, outside the former Soviet space. So Russia has some basically foreign military installations, not dozens, definitely not hundreds in 170, 150 countries, whatever the number that the U.S. is engaged in or has locations in at this point. And China, who is supposed to be the great threat to the United States, has one overseas facility. Maybe let's say this is a lie, and let's say it's like 5 times greater than that. And they have 5 of them compared to hundreds. There's no comparison. So I think it's just important to point this out because it's just important to point it out. I'm going to get a little bit further into this on the Air Force here in a moment. There's a really good article from fee.org that I saw this week. And Melvin points out the same thing. The excessive spending on the Air Force is the most wasteful of all. They're obsessed with fighter superiority in an era without a threat. There's no one that can compare to the U.S. Air Force on Earth, not even close. They've spent billions of dollars on advanced aircraft, the F-22, the B-1 bomber, and those two have never been deployed in Iraq or Afghanistan or any other combat zone. It was designed back in the mid-'80s to deal with Soviet fighter planes that were never even built. And then they killed it to make way for the F-35, which ended up being, or is currently, the most expensive military system in history, in the history of the world. And he goes on, and I'll talk a little bit more about F-35 here in just a moment, but just briefly a few pieces that I've highlighted here. He talks about the Navy. It has total dominance at sea for the past 6 decades. Total dominance over the rest of the world. I mean, if you think about these naval ships, they're so concerned about Iran or another country in the Strait of Hormuz being able to attack an aircraft carrier. And if that's the case, then obviously maybe they're involved in too many different places on too many missions. And that's how Melvin put it. And I agree. And he says the U.S. Marines, on the other hand, has more planes, ships, armored vehicles, and personnel in uniform than the entire British military. So the greatest empire in history that the U.S. seceded from in the American Revolution, now one branch of that so-called land of the free, one branch of the military is larger than the entire British military. So that, I think, should give us some pause as well. And then he also concludes, one of the best kept secrets of the past 60 years has been the high cost of producing and maintaining nuclear weapons, somewhere between $5 and $6 trillion. $5 and $6 trillion is somewhere around the amount that they're spending on this to maintain the ability to blow up the entire globe. So the whole article is actually really interesting. It's peppered with some garbage, but I think some of the commentary about how the U.S. government has so much power in comparison to these other countries is actually really worth reading. I do want to point out again the F-35 program. There's an entire article from Elijah Henry that was just published, I guess, this morning, but for those of you who are listening or watching, it was Tuesday, September 3rd. The F-35 project has been a disastrous waste of money. And Elijah starts out the article talking about the insane amount of a debt, which is 23 trillion. And then he talks about another 200 trillion in unfunded liabilities. Basically, what Chalmers Johnson said in that speech at the time was the amount of money that's being borrowed from China to keep this whole thing afloat is nuts. He basically said things that can't go on forever don't. So this will come crashing down at some point. We don't know when, but it certainly cannot continue forever. You can't continue. I mean, if you just think about running up a credit card, sooner or later, the bills come due and they don't have the money to pay this off. And so he points out that the number one budget item for 2019 is Social Security. The second largest is defense. The U.S. government, he says, spends more on defense than any other country in the world by far. In fact, it spends about as much as the next 8 countries combined. Or we can take, let's say it's the next 7, the next 8, all of them. Basically, the point is it spends a ton in comparison to everyone else. And he puts it this way. He said, is spending of that magnitude necessary or even justifiable? Well, probably not. He says, we all heard the infamous examples of gross waste. For example, $21 trillion that wasn't accounted for over a period of a couple decades, $1,300 cups, $1,000 pliers, $640 toilet seats. Somebody's got a buddy in the contracting business that is billing the U.S. government out of $1,000 for a set of pliers. I mean, I don't know if they're still doing this, but if it gets found out a few years previous, you know that the next thing they find is going to be, I don't know, $1,500 for a flip phone or something just crazy like that. And this happens over and over, year in and year out, that they're spending way too much on basic stuff. It's just a cash cow. But he points out that one of the biggest boondoggles in the U.S. DoD budget, Department of Defense, and the focus of this article is the F-35, which is the most expensive weapon system in history. And of course, he says the costs continue to go up. They first started doing bids for it in 96. They first started getting manufactured in 2006. And they didn't even see combat until 2018, and that was by Israel. Now, this particular plane ran through it's had all kinds of problems. It doesn't work well, it's got some technical issues, and they continue to spend more and more and more on it. And he says, despite all this, the F-35 program will cost about $1.5 trillion just to build one plane that is almost never used. Almost never used. They're spending $1.5 trillion. This is approximately what the U.S. government spent on the entire Iraq war. And I have mentioned it on this show in the past briefly. There was a documentary I saw a number of years ago called Why We Fight. They interviewed Chalmers Johnson, who I mentioned just before, a number of times throughout the film, wondering how does this whole system go? And this same article from Elijah talks about this same thing. He basically said, they start a new weapon system, and what they do is they make sure that each part of it is built in a different district. So you could have one plane or one tank or just one system, but the funding for it creates jobs, and I put that in air quotes, of course, it creates jobs in dozens, if not hundreds of congressional districts. So the people who are incumbents there, they don't want to vote against continuing to fund that program, because then the people back home are like, well, what about the 500 jobs in the small town of blank? And so it creates a real pressure on these spineless politicians who really don't have principle. All they care about is getting reelected. And Elijah goes along the same line. He says, how does a project like this happen and continue despite perpetual problems? He says there are 1,400 subcontractors for the F-35 program spread out over 307 congressional districts in 45 states. 307 districts in 45 states build the parts for this F-35 plane. That means it's never going away. It doesn't matter if it costs $10 trillion. It's already up to $1.5 trillion. It barely works, or they finally have gotten it going. They don't really use it. And even if they did, it's still $1.5 trillion when they're already spending more than everybody else. Elijah puts it this way. For those of you unfamiliar with the U.S. political system, that means there are 307 congressmen out of 435. And 90 senators out of 100 who have constituents whose livelihoods depend in whole or in part on the F-35 plane program. So 90% of senators have constituents who rely on this program, who are working in this program. And 307, I went to government school. My math is horrible. Maybe I can pull up a calculator. What would it be? 307 divided by 435. So 70% of the House of Representatives has people elected where there are jobs in their district putting together the F-35 or making parts for or whatever. And then 90% of the Senate. So the odds of that program ever going away, I think, are almost zero. And he talks at the end here in conclusion, like, okay, maybe the problems will go away and maybe they'll figure out some of the cost overrun. But he says, what's the point of this anyways? He says, I want to draw your attention to absurd levels of waste and inefficiencies inherent to the government system. And I want to suggest that such waste is inevitable in the system as it stands. Absolutely. And in fact, there's been some calls because that GAO report, they did this audit and they said, this is not a satisfactory grade. You don't get a good grade. So over the last year or two, the Pentagon is claiming that it's cutting waste. So they've cut about $18 billion in waste, they say, between 2017 and 3 years, basically $6 billion per year out of almost $1 trillion. So a tiny, tiny amount. And they can't even prove it. This is the report from the GAO. This actually came out from InsideDefense.com this week. The Defense Department says its ongoing reform efforts have saved or are expected to save $18 billion between fiscal years 2017 and 2020. But the GAO, that's the Government Accountability Office, says the Defense Department can't prove it. And here's the quote. Although DoD officials told GAO that the department is making progress implementing the plan's initiatives and achieving cost savings on its broader efforts, DoD provided limited documentation of that progress. As a result, GAO could not independently assess and verify this progress. And let's just chalk it up as they are probably lying. I mean, they've got 3 years that they can only cut that tiny amount, that $6 billion per year on average versus 700, 800 billion. It's just basically a % or two. And they can't even prove that with documentation. I don't think we should trust that they're doing any cuts at all. In fact, we know they're increasing the budget and they're increasing the spending every time they get a chance. And this should be a great reminder to us. Thomas Paine told us so many years ago, his great study of history. This is I think you could read this in any era throughout history and probably throughout the future as well. He put it this way: taxes were not raised to carry on wars. Wars were raised to carry on taxes. I hope you guys found this educational, interesting to watch, entertaining. I really appreciate you spending some time with me here in my kind of remote mobile studio for the day. Apologize for any quality errors that may be happening on video, but hopefully the audio is coming through loud and clear. That's the most important part. If you support the show, you like this episode, you like it in general, make sure to smash the like button on whatever platform you're watching or listening on. Share the link, leave some comments, whether it's live or in the archive. All of these platforms you may watch on, whether it's Periscope, YouTube, Facebook, DLive, BitChute, Brighteon. Well, Brighteon I don't think has an algorithm. That's run by Mike Adams. I don't think he's doing that over there. But most of the platforms that you may watch or listen on has an algorithm. And when you take these free actions, a like, a comment, a subscribe, a share, what that does is it tells the algorithm that they should show it to more people. So I really appreciate all those free actions you may take. And then, of course, if you're on iTunes or listening to a podcast, leaving a review really helps out a lot. And of course, if you want to support us financially, it's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. As little as $2 a month goes a long, long way here at the TAC. Thanks again for spending a few minutes of your day with me today. I really, really appreciate it. I'll check out the comments here just shortly after we get all the archive versions posted on Wednesday. And again, thanks for spending time with me today. I'll see you on Friday here on the Path to Liberty.